Kharkov, the Soviet Spring Offensive, 12th of May to 21st of May, 1942. So this is a magazine game, so there's a whole bunch of articles that come with it. And there's actually two copies of the rules. There's a copy of the rules that's in the magazine itself, and then there's another copy of the rules that's separate from the magazine. And they seem to be identical. I would just say that the text is a bit clearer on the external version, although this looks pretty good in the video. It's just a bit, to me, this is a bit clearer. This looks a bit more, I don't know what the word would be, inky, like, yeah, I'm not sure how to describe it. So what I think I'll do is I'll use the external one, and then if I have any issues, I can switch to the one in the magazine. So, Kharkov, the Soviet Spring Offensive, 12th of May to 21st of May, 1942. Introduction, general course of play, game equipment, sequence of play, how to set up the game. I wish modern manuals or modern rules included this section. Movement, overrun, stacking in zones of control, combat, headquarters units, supply, untried units, air power, German mechanized divisional integration, German infantry divisional breakdown, strong points and garrisons, reinforcements, victory conditions. Okay. Introduction. Kharkov is a brigade divisional level simulation of the spring 1942 Soviet strategic offensive. Each game turn equals 1 day of real time. Each hex equals 6.9 kilometers. General course of play. Kharkov is a two-player game. One player controls the Soviet forces, and the other the German and Romanian Axis forces. The game consists of 10 game turns. So that would be 10 days, I guess? Yeah. Oh, yeah. In each game turn, both players may move individual counters representing units which participate in the actual battle and involve them in combat as he chooses. It's interesting, it's brigade level, because a lot of operational games nowadays are like regiment level. Or divisional level. Both players may move it. Basically, the game is divided into two periods. The dividing point is game turn 5, when the Axis troops in the southern sector are released. In the first half of the game, the Axis player must hang on grimly with relatively few troops. But the Soviet player had better make hay while the sun shines, because the latter half of the game is generally dominated by the Axis player through the conduct of his counteroffensive. Thus, in Kharkov, both players are called upon to both attack and defend. And to win, a player must perform well at both. The game system of Kharkov is an adaptation of the system pioneered in SPI's Panzer Group Guderian game. Players familiar with that game, or with wargames in general, should refer to the rules summary at the end of the rules, which highlights differences between the two games. Game equipment. The game map and charts. The 22-inch by 32-inch map sheet portrays the area in which the battle was fought, including all terrain with 3 R's. Okay, I wonder if is that in the magazine? Because if that error is in the magazine, let's see. I'm trying to figure out which if these were not done at the same time. Okay, yeah, it's the same in the magazine. Okay. So I think it's just a copy. It's just like a straight copy of the rules in the magazine. Including all terrain significant to the battle. A hexagonal grid superimposed over the terrain features regularizes movement and the positioning of the playing pieces. Also printed on the map sheet are various charts and visual aids. The playing pieces. The cardboard pieces represent the military units that took part in the actual battle. The numbers and symbols on the pieces represent the strength, movement capability, and type of unit represented by that piece. These playing pieces will hereafter be referred to as units. Okay. How to read the units. Typical infantry division. It's got the unit size, the unit type, unit designation. So it's like their number, their name, their ID. Attack strength, defense strength, movement allowance. Totally standard. Back. Untried status. Okay, so that's unusual. And that's something I've heard is unique about this game. Normally on the back of a counter you would have a weakened state, representing like, yeah, a weaker version of it. Alright, typical Panzer regiment. Front is the division, parent division, the regiment ID, combat strength, movement allowance. Yeah, all totally. Although that looks like a mechanized infantry regiment. Parentheses indicate reduced strength. Okay, so yeah, that's more normal. Typical headquarters unit. It's the 6th Army, the name of the leader, movement allowance, and the command radius. Got it. On the back, the deployment hex, the game turn of entry, non-active status. I'm not sure what that would be. I'll have to look for that in the rules. Unit designations are the historical identity numbers of the units. Divisions have but one number, while each Panzer regiment counter has both its regimental number and the number of the division of which that regiment is a constituent part. Unit size symbols are as follows. 3 lines is a regiment, an X is a brigade, and 2 X's is a division. Summary of unit types. Units. You have the German Infantry Division, the Soviet Tank Brigade, okay, German Panzer Regiment, okay, Soviet Cavalry Division, Soviet Army Reserve Counter, game turn 5, okay, Airpoint Marker, Soviet HQ Unit. The Simonitch games have stuff like these, Airpoint, that you can spend. Soviet HQ Unit. Markers, Disruption, Strongpoint. Okay. Unit values. Combat strength is the relative strength of a unit. Note that all Soviet units have 2 combat strength ratings, an attack strength and a defense strength. Oh. Where was that? Soviet. All Soviet. Oh, okay, right. So it has, right, 3 numbers. Whereas the German, this one just has one combat number. Okay, that's totally standard. Combat strength may be affected by supply, terrain considerations, or mechanized divisional integration, axis only, or whether the unit is executing an overrun. Note that many Soviet units have an untried, that is unknown, combat strength at start. Movement point allowance is the maximum number of movement points that may be expended in moving a particular unit during a movement phase. Command radius is the maximum number of hexes away from a combat unit a headquarters unit may be and still be able to affect the supply status of that unit. Oh, supply status. So in more modern games, it would be the range at which a unit could be activated to move. Okay. Parts inventory. A complete game of Kharkov includes the following parts: a 22-inch by 32-inch game map, 1 rules folder, 1 sheet of die-cut counters, 200 pieces printed front and back, a game box or Ziploc bag not included in the subscription edition, 1 plastic die not included in the subscription edition. If any of these parts are missing or damaged, please write okay. Rules questions. Questions concerning the rules for Kharkov will be answered if phrased in such a way that a simple yes or no or one-word reply will suffice, and if the questions are accompanied by a stamped self-addressed envelope. Okay. Sequence of play. The game turn. Kharkov is played in game turns. Each game turn is composed of 2 player turns. The player whose player turn is in progress is often called the phasing player. Each game turn proceeds strictly as outlined in case 4.2. 4.2 Game turn sequence outline. Soviet player turn. Reserve commitment phase. The Soviet player may place on the game map reserve units eligible to be committed. See case 6.7. No reserves may be committed during game turn 1. Okay, so those are like reinforcements. Reinforcements phase. Movement phase. The Soviet player checks his unit's supply status. He also checks to see if any of his non-active headquarters become activated. Not sure what that means yet. Reinforcements scheduled to arrive this game turn are placed on the game map. Oh, so that's different from reserve. Okay, I'll have to wait to see what that means. Any or all Soviet units may now be moved in any direction to the limit of each unit's movement allowance and within the restrictions outlined in the rules for movement and supply. The Soviet player may conduct overruns in this phase. Combat phase. Soviet units may attack Axis units according to the rules of combat. The Soviet air point may be allocated to a combat, as may Axis air points for defense. Axis air points, okay. Disruption removal phase. The Soviet player removes disruption markers from any of his units that suffered disruption as a result of Axis overrun. Any headquarters units that are displaced are activated. Okay, not sure what that means yet. Axis player turn. Initial movement phase. After checking supply, the Axis player may move his units, bring in reinforcements, and conduct overruns. Combat phase. Axis units may attack Soviet units, and both sides may allocate available air points. Mechanized movement phase. German panzer and motorized infantry units may move again if possible. Overruns may be conducted. Disruption removal phase. The Axis player removes disruption markers from his units. Air supply phase. The Axis player may use any air points not used during this game turn to provide complete supply for designated units for the entire following game turn. Interesting. Okay. Interesting, okay. Game turn indication. The Soviet player notes any victory points he has earned and advances the game turn marker. How to set up the game. Procedure. The Axis player sets up his units first. He determines which of his units begin the game on the map and divides those units into 7 groups. See case 5.2, Axis initial deployment. Okay. Group by group, he places the units on the map. Meanwhile, the Soviet player segregates his units into 4 groups: untried rifle divisions, untried cavalry divisions, untried tank brigades, and everything else. All untried units are placed on the table, untried side up. Many Soviet units are in reserve at the start of the game, and these are placed in the reserve boxes. After the Axis player has completed his deployment, the Soviet player places his units on the map. Players place their respective reinforcements on their pictures on the game turn record reinforcement track, and the game turn marker is placed in the first space of the track. Cases. 5.1. Restrictions on initial deployment. All units with more than one step, see case 9.5, begin the game at full highest strength. Most Soviet units begin the game untried. They are deployed at random, untried side up, so that neither player knows their actual strength. German infantry divisions may start the game broken down into regiments. Unless otherwise stated, all units at the start of the game must be adjacent to or within 1 hex of the 12th of May 1942 front line. Each hex adjacent to each player's side of the front line must be occupied by or be in the zone of control of that player's units. Axis initial deployment. Location on front line between points 1 and 2. Units 79, 294, 297 infantry divisions. 1 unit. Division or regiment may be deployed in any hex of Kharkov. Okay, well, I don't have the map really. Can't really open it up right now. But, I mean, this is the line that represents the front line. Yeah, you can see it goes up here. There's the Donets River. So then you've got these divisions, these divisions, these divisions. Okay. These divisions. These divisions. Okay, so it is somewhat prescribed. Soviet initial deployment. So this 1 guard rifle division, you don't know the exact one. 6 rifle divisions, 2 tank brigades. Okay. Four rifle divisions, 1 tank brigade. Okay. This I'm a little bit confused by. How do you tell the difference between a guard rifle division and a normal rifle division? Is that just how it... Is that the way... I guess, I imagine you'll be able to tell from the counter. But, okay. Note. The Soviet Guards rifle divisions are not untried. They are deployed as listed above at the whim of the Soviet player, with knowledge of their strengths. Okay, so I'm guessing that these are going to be counters that don't have an untried side. And it's probably written on the counter. Movement. General rule. Movement occurs during the movement phases of each game turn. During each player's respective movement phase, he may move all, some, or none of his active units as desired. The phasing player may also conduct overruns and or move units by rail. During the German player's mechanized movement phase, he may move some, all, or none of his active Panzer or Panzer Grenadier units. He may also conduct overruns. Procedure. Each unit or stack of units is moved individually, hex by hex. Movement of a unit into a hex costs a certain number of movement points. As a player moves a unit into each hex, he keeps track of the number of movement points expended. Once a player's hand is removed from the unit stack, movement is completed for that unit. General restrictions on movement of units. Movement is calculated in terms of movement points. Each unit has a movement point allowance, indicating the maximum number of movement points that can be expended for the movement of that unit in any one movement phase. A player may expend as few or as many movement points as desired in moving one of his units, up to the limit of that unit's movement point allowance. Movement points may not be saved from one game turn to the next, nor may unused movement points be transferred from unit to unit. During a player's movement phase, no enemy units owned by the opposing player, may be moved. These were the days when you had to specify these things. Combat may not occur during any movement phase. However, overrun, a combination of movement and combat, may take place. Effects of terrain, other units, and zones of control on movement. For each clear terrain hex into which a player moves a unit, 1 movement point is expended. Other terrain costs more, or in the case of roads for mechanized units, less, to enter or cross. These costs are summarized on the terrain effects chart, which is on the map, and I don't really want to open up the map right now. Friendly units in no way affect or impede the movement of other friendly units. However, see case 8.1. A unit may never be moved into a hex containing an enemy unit. Friendly zones of control never affect the movement of friendly units. A unit that is moved into a hex that is in an enemy zone of control must stop and cannot be moved any further that game turn. Generally, a unit may not be moved out of a hex that is in an enemy zone of control. Exceptions: overrun, Soviet breakout mobility, and okay. A unit may not be moved out of a hex that is in an enemy zone of control. Wow, that's I don't think I've ever seen that before. Normally, what you have to do is you have to pay a certain number of movement points to leave a zone of control, or they'll let you leave for free, but you have to pay to enter. A friendly unit may not be moved across a major river into a hex that is in an enemy zone of control exerted by a unit that is itself adjacent to the river, unless the friendly unit successfully conducts an overrun across the river, or the hex is already occupied by a friendly unit. Note, this rule does not apply to advance after combat, which is not considered movement per se. Okay, that's interesting. So this is, this is an interesting rule. I have not seen this kind of rule before. But it makes sense. Any unit, including Soviet Army reserve counters, that is out of supply has its movement point allowance halved for the current movement phase, dropping any fractions. Terrain effects chart. See map. Okay, do I want to try to open this map up a little bit? Let's try opening it up a little bit. Just don't want to damage it. That is my concern. Don't want to damage the map. Okay, it looks like I'll be able to open this up without damaging it. So here's the terrain effects chart. Clear hex is 1 movement point, no effect on combat. Forest hex is 1 movement point for non-motorized infantry, 2 for all others. So vehicles can move into forest hexes. That is unusual. Normally with these operational games, from what I've seen, they cannot. But although maybe the Victory Awaits game they can, I don't remember. Major city, 1 for infantry, 1/2 for, I guess that's assuming that's like because there's roads. Minor city depends on the terrain and the hex. Donetsk River, okay, 1 for the infantry, 2 for everybody else. Dnieper, only crossable at a road. Minor rivers, an additional 1, right? Roads, it's 1 for infantry, 1/2 for all others. Railroad hex, got it. Okay, and the rest of that is CRT, stuff to be looked at later. Okay. Rail movement. In order to be moved by rail, a unit must begin and end the movement phase in friendly rail hexes. It must be moved from friendly rail hex to adjacent connected friendly rail hex without ever leaving the railroad during the phase. It need not begin the movement phase in supply to be moved by rail. All rail hexes on the Axis side of the 12th of May 1942 front line are friendly to the Axis player. All other rail hexes are friendly to the Soviet player. Units moving by rail may not be moved into an enemy-controlled hex. Okay, it's interesting because in Simonitch Stalingrad game, you have a rail head. So as the Axis take territory, their friendly rails hexes expand with their territory. So units moving by rail may not be moved into an enemy-controlled hex. Any unit being moved by rail, regardless of its movement point allowance, may be moved through a maximum of 40 rail hexes. Okay. The Axis player may move a maximum of 3 units of any size by rail during his initial movement phase of each game turn. He may not use rail movement during his mechanized movement phase. The Soviet player may move a maximum of 5 units, plus any number of headquarters units, by rail during his movement phase. Railroads afford no movement advantages or disadvantages whatsoever to units not being moved by rail, including units crossing rivers. Okay. So basically they can move, the units that are moved can move 40 hexes, 40 rail hexes. Additional restrictions on Axis movement. Operation Frederikus and last game turn limitation on mechanized movement. No Axis units south of the north-south sector line may move or attack until activated. Okay. North-south sector line may move or attack until activated. If any Axis unit south of the north-south sector line is attacked, all are immediately activated. If any Soviet unit is moved south of the north-south sector line, west of the front line, all Axis units are immediately activated. If the Soviet player fails to occupy or control each hex adjacent to his side of the 12th of May 1942 front line south of the north-south sector line at the end of any Soviet player turn, all Axis units are immediately activated. Okay, let me try to see what that looks like on the map here. So if I open this up, okay, so this is Kharkov. So that's the north. So this is the south. Okay, so I think it's this green line. That's my guess. It's the green line is the north-south sector line, and then this blue line is the the front line, whatever they call it, the 12th of May, 1942 front line. And then it continues here, and it goes up like that, and then around like here. Okay. Okay. Gives me some idea of what they're talking about. So units south of the line cannot move or attack until activated. If any Axis units south of the line are attacked, they are all activated. If any Soviet unit is moved south of the north-south sector line west of the front line, all Axis units are immediately activated. If the Soviet player fails to occupy or control each hex adjacent to his side of the 12th of May 1942 front line south of the north-south sector line at the end of any Soviet player turn, all Axis units are immediately activated. If any units of the Soviet 9th Army Reserve are committed prior to game turn 4, all Axis units are immediately activated. If any units of the Soviet 9th Army Reserve are committed prior to game turn 4, all Axis... Okay. All Axis units not previously activated are activated on game turn 5. For the entire first game turn in which they are activated, all Axis units deployed south of the north-south sector line are considered in supply. On game turn 10 only, the Axis player has no mechanized movement phase. German tactical disengagement. German units only may be moved out of an enemy-controlled hex, disengage, at a cost of 3 movement points. A unit in the zone of control of one or more Soviet units at the beginning of an Axis movement phase only may be disengaged into a hex that is not in a Soviet zone of control only. If the disengagement of a German unit or stack of units results in a hex being vacated, that is, no Axis unit remains in that hex, the Soviet player has the option to immediately advance into it, any Soviet units that is adjacent to that hex, at no movement point cost, and regardless of the presence of Axis zones of control. Exception to case 6.13. This option to chase must be exercised at once, the instant that the hex in question is vacated, and before the vacating units has moved more than one hex. This is an interesting rule. I have not seen a rule like this in more modern games. A unit may be disengaged, and any Soviet unit may be used to chase any number of times. A unit may be disengaged, and any Soviet unit may be used to chase any number of times. Interesting. Should a unit which has been successfully disengaged, not chased, be moved into a hex in an enemy zone of control, its movement must cease for that phase. So, I guess they're using the term successful disengagement to mean you disengage and you're not chased, something like that. Okay. German units may never be disengaged across a major river. German units may not be disengaged under any circumstances on game turn 1. Additional restrictions on Soviet movement. Commitment of reserves and southern sector troops. The Soviet player has 4 Army Reserve counters. Each reserve counter represents the forces which begin the game in the appropriate reserve box on the game map. Army Reserve counters are treated as infantry combat units, except that they have a movement point allowance of 4, may not be moved by rail, and may not be moved to within 3 hexes of an Axis unit. Okay. It's an unusual rule. I've not seen something like this before. Units in reserve boxes remain therein until committed. When committed, units are placed within 2 hexes of the Army Reserve counter in accord with stacking restrictions. If all units in a reserve have been released, the Army Reserve counter is removed. Interesting. I've not seen a rule like this before. Committed reserves may be moved and attack normally on the game turn they are committed. However, they are in supply only if within the command radius of an active headquarters unit. That is, in turn, in supply. The Soviet player may commit a maximum of 3 units from any of his reserves on game turn 2, and again on game turn 3, during his reserve commitment phase. The Soviet player may immediately commit all units in a given Army Reserve if the Axis player moves to within 3 hexes of that respective Army Reserve counter. Interesting. On game turn 4, or at any time thereafter, The Soviet player may commit all uncommitted reserve units. Prior to the activation of the Axis units south of the north-south sector line, Soviet units that begin the game south of the line may be moved north of it only by rail, after which they may be moved normally. Soviet breakout mobility. On game turns 1 and 2, and only on those turns, any Soviet combat unit which begins the movement phase in an enemy zone of control may leave that Axis-controlled hex and move directly into any non-enemy occupied hex, regardless of the presence of enemy zones of control. However, such infiltrating units must stop if and when they enter an enemy zone of control other than the one they left, similar to normal movement. Okay, so this is like encouraging the attacking at the beginning of the Soviets. Overrun. General rule. During his movement phase, the phasing player may have any active unit or stack of units attempt to overrun an enemy unit. An overrun is an attempt to move into an enemy occupied hex. A successful overrun results in the elimination or retreat of the enemy units. A successful overrunning unit occupies the hex and may be further moved up to the extent of its movement point allowance. Units successfully overrun are disrupted. Note, although bearing some resemblance to combat, overrun is a function of movement. Okay, interesting. So this is similar to Standard Combat Series, which has a rule there where you can attack during your movement phase. Okay. Procedure. By expending 3 movement points, the phasing player has a friendly unit or stack of units execute an overrun against an adjacent enemy unit. The phasing player totals the attack strength of his units, taking into account any terrain considerations, and halves it, dropping any fractions. Halves it, okay. So that's different from SCS. In SCS, you get your full combat strength. The non-phasing player totals the defense strength of his units, taking into account terrain and supply considerations. An attack by the phasing player's units is then resolved. If the overrun is successful, the overrunning units is moved into the vacated hex, and the phasing player may then continue moving into the overrunning units. And the phasing player may then continue moving the overrunning units, assuming it still retains unexpended movement points. Got it. Yeah, so in the Simonitch games, you get an overrun. I think it's if you have 10-to-1 odds. Or is that... I think that's... I don't remember. There's a rule in the Simonitch games about if you have overwhelming odds, you can move through weaker units. Restrictions on overruns. Overruns may be conducted only by the phasing player, only during his movement phase, or for the Axis player, mechanized movement phase. Overruns may never be conducted during a combat phase. A unit or stack of units must be in supply at the beginning of the movement phase prior to the movement of any units to be eligible to execute an overrun. Units that begin the movement phase stacked in the same hex may be used to execute an overrun, provided they are not moved independently until the overrun has been resolved. A single overrun can be conducted against more than one enemy unit only if all such enemy units occupy the same hex. A single overrun may not be directed against units in more than one hex. There is no limit to the number of overruns which may be executed against the same unit in the same movement phase. There is no limit to the number of overruns which an Axis unit may conduct, except the restrictions of the unit's movement allowance. Theoretically, a German panzer division could conduct 4 separate overruns in one movement phase. No Soviet unit can ever execute more than one overrun in a single movement phase. The Soviet player may conduct only one overrun per movement phase for each active headquarters unit he possesses. Each Soviet unit, or stack of units, that is used to execute an overrun must begin the movement phase within the command radius of a different active headquarters unit. That is, no headquarters unit may supervise more than one overrun per game turn. Resolution of overruns. Armor superiority and German divisional integration apply to overrun on either attack or defense. Soviet breakthrough morale bonuses and air power are not applied to overrun. Supply for units defending against overrun is determined at the instant of resolution. This is an interesting rule because this is the kind of rule that encourages surrounding units in some game systems, whereas in other game systems, supply is determined during a supply phase and would not be affected by getting surrounded during the other player's attack, during the other player's turn. Okay, should an overrun attack fail to dislodge the enemy units from the overrun hex, the units executing the overrun may not be moved any further in that movement phase. That's an interesting rule. Should an overrun attack result in the retreat of or any loss to the overrunning units, it may not be moved any further, except to retreat as called for in that movement phase, regardless of whether it has any remaining movement points or whether the hex overrun has been vacated. Should an overrun result in the retreat or elimination of all defending units, and no loss or retreat for the overrunning units, then the latter must be advanced into the vacated hex at no additional cost in movement points, and regardless of any enemy zones of control. And the phasing player may continue moving the units if they have movement points remaining. Enemy units that successfully defend against an overrun may not be advanced into a vacated hex if overrunning units retreat or are destroyed. Disruption. Units that defend against an overrun and suffer any loss or retreat, not including an engaged result, as a result of the overrun, are disrupted. Only defending units can become disrupted, and disruption pertains only to overrun, not to normal combat. Disruption is indicated by placing a disrupted marker on top of the units. Disrupted units may not attack. They defend normally. They may not move. They exert a zone of control. Additional disruption results and/or normal combat results have no further effect on disrupted units. Disrupted units automatically return to normal in the applicable friendly disruption removal phase. Headquarters units never become disrupted. Disrupted German regimental breakdown units may not form strongpoints. Stacking and zones of control. General rule. No more than 3 combat units may be stacked in a single hex. The 6 hexes surrounding a hex constitute the zone of control of any combat units in that hex. Such hexes are referred to as controlled hexes. Friendly zones of control inhibit the movement of enemy units. Zones of control extend into all 6 hexes adjacent to the controlling unit's hex. Cases. Stacking restrictions. Neither side may ever have more than 3 combat units in any one hex at the end of a movement phase, and at any time during the combat phase. Headquarters units and disruption markers do not count against stacking limits. Units may pass freely through other friendly stacks, except during retreats. If units exceed the stacking restrictions at the end of a friendly movement phase, or at any time during a combat phase, the excess units, owning player's choice, is considered eliminated and removed from the game. Except during retreats. That's interesting, because normally in the other games that I've seen, units, you can pass through friendly stacks during retreats. So that could be brutal for units if they can't retreat through friendly stacks during a retreat. They would get eliminated. So that could be a key rule. Zones of control. All combat units exert a zone of control at all times. Headquarters units have no zone of control. There is no additional movement point cost to move a friendly unit into an enemy-controlled hex. Generally, a player may not move a unit out of an enemy-controlled hex. However, the Axis player may use German tactical disengagement, the Soviet player may use Soviet breakout mobility, and both may use overruns to do so. Friendly units may also leave enemy-controlled hexes as a result of combat. Friendly zones of control never affect friendly units. There is no additional effect of having more than one unit exerting its zone of control onto a given hex. Friendly units, but not friendly zones of control, negate enemy zones of control for purposes of tracing supply lines and retreats. They do not negate enemy zones of control for the purposes of movement. So this part is confusing for the purpose of retreat, because they previously said you could not retreat through a friendly stack. So I don't understand why here it's saying they're talking about eliminating zones of control for the purpose of retreats. Maybe what they mean is that you can't overstack during a retreat. So if a hex already has 3 combat units in it, then you can't pass a 4th combat unit through it to retreat. Maybe that's what they mean there. Combat. General rule. Combat occurs between adjacent opposing units at the phasing player's discretion. The phasing player is termed the attacker, and the non-phasing player is termed the defender, regardless of the overall strategic situation. Procedure. Total the attack strengths of all the attacking units involved in a specific attack, and compare it to the total defense strength of the units in the hex under attack. State the comparison as a probability ratio of attacker's strength to defender's strength. Probability ratio, that's an unusual term to use for that. Round off the ratio in favor of the defender. For example, 29 to 10 is 2 to 1, to conform to the simple ratios found on the combat results table. Roll 1 die and read the results on the appropriate line under the ratio. Apply the result immediately, before resolving any other combat. Cases. Which units may attack? Units may attack only during their own combat phase. They may attack any and all enemy units to which they are adjacent. Only those units directly adjacent to a given enemy unit may participate in an attack upon that unit. Attacking is voluntary. Units are never compelled to attack, and not every unit adjacent to an enemy unit need participate in an attack. A friendly unit that is not participating in a given attack is never affected by the results of that attack. An enemy-occupied hex may be attacked by as many units as can be brought to bear in the 6 adjacent hexes. No unit may attack more than once per combat phase, and no enemy unit may be attacked more than once per combat phase. Remember, overrun is not combat. In order for a Soviet unit to attack, it must be within the command radius of an active headquarters unit at the instant of combat. Multiple unit and multi-hex combat. All units in a hex must be attacked as a single combined defense strength. The defender may not withhold a unit in a hex under attack. Other units in a hex that contains an attacking unit need not participate in that or any other combat. Thus, when one unit in a stack is attacking a given hex, the other units in the stack could attack a different hex or not attack at all. If a unit is adjacent to more than one enemy-occupied hex, it could attack all of them in a single combat. If a unit is adjacent to more than one enemy-occupied hex, it could attack all of them in a single combat. Thus, units in a single hex may attack more than one hex. The only requirement is that all attacking units must be adjacent to all defending units. I have never seen a rule like this before. Usually the rule is that a unit can only attack once per turn. I have never seen a rule like that before. Wow, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. A given unit's attack and or defense strength is always unitary. That is, it may not be divided either for attack or defense. Effects of terrain on combat. Units defending in forest and city hexes have their defense only strength doubled. For example, a unit defending in hex 0618 with a printed defense strength of 4 would have a defense strength of 8. Can I find 0618 quickly? Let's see. Looking. Here we go. So I'm looking at the map. 06, 12, 10, 9, 06, 0618. 0618 is here. There. Okay. So a unit defending in that hex with a printed defense strength of 4 would have a defense strength of 8. Each unit attacking through a major river hex side has its attack strength only halved, retaining fractions. This is true even in a combined attack where one unit is attacking across a major river while another is not. Only the unit attacking across the river is halved. For example, a 5 attacks across the Donets with the support of an 8, which is not attacking across the Donets. The total attack strength would be 10.5. 8 plus 5 divided by 2 is 10.5. Got it. If all units in a given attack are attacking across a minor river, for example, the Oskal, if all units in a given attack are attacking across a minor river, hex side, or some are attacking across a minor river and some are attacking across a major river, then the attacker adds 1 to his die roll when determining the outcome of the battle. Okay? All terrain effects are cumulative. When determining the final strength of a unit, first multiply for all increase effects, doubling for terrain, defense, etc. Then halve for supply, etc., if applicable. Okay? Combat results table. See the map. Okay, let's see if I can open this up. So, if I open this, it's not here. So it'll be one more. Here it is. Okay. So, I guess, yeah, I may as well read these explanations now. So, explanation of combat results. AE. All attacking or defending units are eliminated. So that's like here. So that is when you are on really bad odds. The attacker has one unit, one combat power for every 3 combat power that the defender has. And you get a roll of 6. So it seems that higher numbers are worse for the defender. Worse for the attacker, sorry. Yeah. So in this case, you want to roll low numbers as the attacker, which is not... In most modern games that I've played, you want to roll higher numbers as the attacker. So AE, all attacking or defending units are eliminated. Opposing player may advance 2 hexes. A1, A2, or D1, D2. The attacker or defender may choose to lose the number of steps or retreat the entire stack the number of hexes indicated, 1 or 2. Units in a stack may be retreated to different hexes. Victorious units may advance along the path of retreat. ENG, engaged. So the A1, D1 thing is unusual, or a little bit unusual, in that most of the time, I think most modern games distinguish between retreat results and loss results, although they do sometimes. And usually what will happen is you'll have like in the Simonitch games, you have a determined defense choice you can make as the defender, where you can roll another die to try to convert retreats, to try to avoid retreats, and possibly convert them into step losses instead. ENG, engaged. Each side must take 1 step loss and remain in place. No retreat or advance after combat is possible. In a split result, for example, D1/A1, like we have here, the defender takes losses or retreats first. Then the attacker must decide to retreat or to lose 1 step. If the step loss is taken, the units may advance after combat. All victorious units may advance after combat. Retreat paths are determined by the owning player. Attacks at greater than 10-1 are treated as 10-1. At less than 1-3 are treated as 1-3. All victorious units may advance after combat means that defending units may advance after combat, which is unusual. In the modern games that I've studied the rules for, it's only the attacker that can ever advance after combat. So that is an interesting difference. Okay, I think that's all for the combat results table. Where are we now? Explanation of combat results. German division and brigade units have a number of strength levels, steps. They may be reduced in strength as a result of combat by 1 or 2 steps at a time. Thus, if a German unit takes a 1-step loss, the counter is replaced by the next lowest strength level counter for that unit. A 9-8 suffering a 1-step loss would be flipped over to its 4-8 side. If it suffered a 2-step loss, it would be replaced by an unnumbered 2-8 division counter. If there are no steps remaining, that unit is eliminated. Most Soviet units consist of only 1 step. If such a Soviet unit receives a 1-step loss, it is eliminated. Headquarters units have no step. Soviet Guard infantry units and Soviet units with an original defense strength of 6 or greater are 2-step units. The former have their reduced strength printed on the back of the counter. The latter, being untried units, have separate counters called replacement counters, which are used as a second step for these units. Place the 5 replacement counters in the Soviet replacement box. and pick one of the correct type when a 6 or greater unit loses 1 step. Okay. All German panzer units have 2 steps, the second step being on the reverse side of the counter's original strength. All German infantry divisions have 4 steps, 9-8, 4-8, 2-8, and 1-8, while light and mountain divisions have 3 steps, 7-8, 3-8, and 1-8. The German Sich division has only 1 step. I'm not sure what that stands for. All combat results are expressed on the table in terms of steps lost or hexes retreated. The letters A and D stand for attacker and defender, respectively. A result of A, E, or DE means that all steps for the units involved are lost, and no retreat option is possible. A result of A or D plus a number, for example A1 or D2, means that the affected units must either lose the given number of steps or retreat all units in that combat the given number of hexes. The player whose unit is so affected may not take a step loss and retreat. He must either retreat or take step losses. Okay, so you can't, if you get a 2 result, like if the defender gets a D2 result, he can't take 1 step loss and retreat 1 hex. When a loss of 1 step is required or chosen, the player removes 1 step from any 1 unit involved. For example, if 3 Soviet units are defending against a German attack and the CRT shows a result of D1, the Soviet player has the option of either removing 1 of his units, or steps, and leaving the remaining units in place, or retreating all 3 units 1 hex. Some results on the CRT are split results, for example D1/A1. In a split result, the defender always takes his result first, whether it is a step loss or a hex retreat. Then the attacker takes his result. If any attacking units remain in their original hex, they may advance after combat, provided the defending hex has been vacated. The defender may never advance in a split result. A result of E and G engaged means that each side must lose. No retreat option is available. In addition, neither side may advance after combat. Retreats. Retreats are always optional. A player may choose to lose steps rather than retreat. However, a unit may never retreat into or through an enemy unit or an enemy-controlled hex, unless the latter hex is occupied by a friendly combat unit. Units may not retreat off the map. Those that do are considered eliminated. Retreats are conducted by the owning player. They specify that because in some games, unusually, I think, Battle for Moscow is an example. Somewhat bizarrely, the attacker chooses the path of retreat for the defender. I've never seen that in any other games, but that's why they specify that. A retreating unit must be retreated the number of hexes away from the original hex of the opposing unit called for in the combat result. A retreating unit must, if possible, retreat into a vacant hex. Exception: a unit may be retreated into a friendly occupied or friendly garrisoned city hex. If no vacant hex is available, it may retreat into or through a friendly occupied hex. Units may not retreat into or through a hex in violation of stacking restrictions. Okay, that was my guess at the interpretation of what it said before about stacking and retreats. I don't understand why they make this distinction for retreats when it's not applied for movement, the movement phase. So it's a little bit bizarre to me. If a unit is forced to retreat into a friendly occupied hex as a result of combat, and that hex then undergoes an attack in that combat phase, the retreated unit does not add its strength to that of the other units in the hex. However, if that new hex suffers any combat result, loss or retreat, the previously retreated unit is automatically eliminated. Wow, okay, that's brutal. Note, this does not apply to overrun, which is not combat. Advance after combat. Whenever an enemy unit is forced to retreat or is eliminated, leaving a hex vacant as a result of combat, it will leave a path of vacant hexes behind it, called the path of retreat. Any or all victorious attacking or defending units which participated in the combat are allowed to advance along the enemy path of retreat. Advancing Axis victorious units may ignore enemy zones of control and may cease advancing in any hex along the path of retreat. Advancing Soviet units must stop when they enter an Axis zone of control. No advancing unit may leave the path of retreat, except in the situation described in Case 9.74. The option to advance after combat must be exercised immediately, before any other combat resolution. Units are never forced to advance after combat. After advancing, units may neither attack nor be attacked if they are defending units advancing in that phase. Icing. Even if their advance places them adjacent to enemy units whose combat is yet to be resolved, or who are not involved in combat. However, advances are useful in cutting off the retreat of enemy units whose combat has not yet been resolved. Right, exactly. So this has happened to me before playing against someone else, where he attacks one group of units, and by doing so advances into their hex, and then when he attacks another group, supply is calculated for that group at that moment, and they're considered to be out of supply, and then they get halved, or whatever the penalty was in that game. I don't remember. So that's a key tactic in some of these games where that works like that. Okay. And that was just for supply. This is for retreat, where if a unit gets a retreat result and it has no way to retreat, then the whole unit gets destroyed. So that's also brutal. If all units in a hex are eliminated, the victorious units may advance a maximum of 2 hexes after combat. If all units in a hex are eliminated, the victorious units may advance a maximum of 2 hexes after combat. The first hex must be the hex formerly occupied by the eliminated units. The second hex may be any vacant or friendly occupied hex. Units advancing after retreating enemy units may advance a maximum of the number of hexes the enemy unit has retreated. For example, a D2 retreat means a possible advance of 2 hexes maximum. Advance after combat does not apply to overrun. Soviet breakthrough morale bonus. The Soviet offensive in the north caught the Germans completely unawares, despite the preparations for Operation Fredericus. This rule simulates that all too brief advantage. On every individual attack that the Soviet player conducts in game turns 1 through 4, he is entitled to a morale adjustment to the basic combat ratio. This adjustment is not available on defense or on Soviet overruns. For each individual attack, the Soviet player on game turns 1 through 4 determines his combat ratio and then checks the Soviet morale bonus table. This is done after all modifiers and air points have been assigned. He then rolls a die to determine what adjustment to his combat ratio he has achieved. The morale adjustment is always in favor of the Soviet player, that is, shifts to the right. Ratios greater than 10 to 1 or worse than 1 to 3 always use the 10 to 1 or 1 to 3 columns as the basis for adjustment. This rule applies to all forms of column adjustment. For example, a 1 to 15 combat adjusted one column in favor of the attacker would be a 1 to 2, adjusted from the 1 to 3 column. After game turn 4, there is no morale adjustment for Soviet attacks. Soviet morale bonus table, see map. Okay, so if I bring the map over here, got the Soviet morale bonus table, game turn 1, 2, 3, 4. For each attack, the Soviet player rolls the die to determine how the high morale of the units in the attack improves their effectiveness. The results are cross-indexed with the current game turn column on the table. The number result is the number of columns that the Soviet player's attack shifts to the right on the combat results table. N means no shift. Okay? This procedure is performed for each Soviet attack up through game turn 4. For example, on game turn 1, the Soviet player is making a 3 to 1 attack. Rolling the die for morale adjustment, he gets a die roll of 4, meaning that the 3 to 1 is changed to a 5 to 1 attack. So game turn 1, and he rolls a 4, so that's 2 shifts in his favor. So that would go from 3 to 1 to 4 to 1 to 5 to 1. Got it. So on average, on a D6, the average roll is, I think, 3.5. It's halfway. So that means an average of like 2.5 shifts on the first game turn, 2 shifts on the second game turn, and 1 shift on the third game turn. So it's quite a lot. Quite a lot. Okay. Armor superiority. If either player has any armored units, that is, Soviet tank and motorized units, or German Panzer or Panzer Grenadier units in a given combat, and the other player has no armored units, the player with the armor receives a 1-column odds adjustment in his favor. This applies whether the player with the armor is defender or attacker. If both players have armor, there is no adjustment. For example, 2 German infantry divisions, 9-8s, attack a Soviet tank brigade, 5-5-11. The basic ratio would be 3 to 1, because the Germans have 2 9-8s, so that's 18, and then 3 times, no, this is just a 5 defense, right, so it's 18 against a 5 defense, which rounds down to 3 to 1. But the Soviets have armor, and the Germans do not, which lowers the combat ratio to 2 to 1. And if you look at like the Simonitch games, some of these games, they get into even like the quality of the armor. So the armor can have a rating, and whichever armor has the higher rating, if both units have armor and one unit has the higher rating, that one gets the shift. So this system can get more complicated. Headquarters units. General rule. Soviet and Romanian units depend upon headquarters units for supply and attack coordination. Cases. Characteristics of active and non-active headquarters units. The front side of each headquarters unit, counter, represents that headquarters unit in an active state, and the back side represents that unit in a non-active state, indicated by the N. Okay. Do I have any of these? Can I dig some of these out so I can... let's see. Okay, so I just dug out some units, headquarters units, or these seem to be headquarters units. So it says, let me drag them over here. The front side represents that headquarters unit in an active state, and the back side represents that unit in a non-active state, indicated by the N. So this is the active state, I think. Then if I flip it over, it says N-5. I don't know what these numbers mean yet, or if I read it before, I forgot about it already. But I think that's what they look like. Okay. Set these aside for a bit. Active headquarters units may be used to enable Soviet or Romanian combat units to attack, and or maintain them in supply. Non-active headquarters units may not be used for either purpose. For either purpose, okay. Headquarters units are moved as if they were non-motorized infantry units for the purpose of calculating movement point costs, except that they are moved along roads as if they were mechanized units. Headquarters units may be moved by rail. Note that the movement point allowance of a non-active headquarters unit is substantially reduced. Okay, so I think that number there is the movement point allowance. And I think that number on the right is the movement point allowance. So it's 11 when it's active, and it's 5 when it's non-active. An HQ unit, active or non-active, stacked with one or more combat units, has no combat strength or step to contribute to attack or defense. Headquarters units may be retreated or advanced after combat along with units with which they are stacked. An HQ unit in a hex in which all the combat units are eliminated is displaced. An HQ unit, or two or more HQ units, alone in a hex may never attack and defends with a combat strength of 1. An HQ unit alone in a hex may be retreated normally if attacked. If retreat is impossible, or if an HQ unit incurs a DE result, it is displaced. Note, headquarters units are never disrupted as a result of overrun. Headquarters units have no zones of control. An HQ unit may freely be placed in a hex containing 3 friendly combat units. That is, they do not count against the stacking limit. An HQ unit which is displaced is immediately placed non-active side up in the nearest hex containing a friendly combat unit. If more than one such hex exists equidistantly, the owning player has the option to select from among them. An HQ unit that has been displaced remains non-active until the following friendly disruption removal phase, when it is reactivated. An HQ unit may never be eliminated so long as a friendly combat unit remains on the game map. So I just refreshed my memory of what these numbers are. This number in the parentheses is the command radius, and it's mentioned earlier in the manual here, command radius, although it doesn't have like an arrow pointing to it, but it does explain. Headquarters units attacking and supply. No Soviet or Romanian combat unit may attack enemy units unless a line of communications can be traced from an active friendly headquarters unit to the combat unit. In order for a Soviet or Romanian combat unit to be in supply, a line of communications must be traceable between the unit and an active friendly headquarters unit that is itself in supply. A line of communications is a line of adjacent hexes no longer than the command radius of the headquarters unit from which it is traced. A line of communications may not be traced through an enemy-occupied hex. It may not be traced through an enemy-controlled hex unless that hex is occupied by a friendly unit. In calculating the length of a line of communication, the hex occupied by the headquarters unit is not counted, and the hex occupied by the combat unit is. There is no limit to the number of units to which a line of communications may be traced from a single active headquarters unit. Okay. A line may be traced to any unit from any friendly active headquarters unit. A Soviet or Romanian combat unit to which a line of communications from an active friendly headquarters unit cannot be traced defends at half strength, as it is out of supply. Only Soviet and Romanian units that begin the movement phase in supply may be used to conduct overruns. Note also that the number of overruns which the Soviet player may conduct is limited by the number of active friendly headquarters units on the game map. Okay. The Axis player may not use the Romanian headquarters unit, General Dragolina, to maintain German units in supply. So I just spent a few minutes trying to understand how this activation mechanic works. And my impression is that it's kind of like being disrupted where, at first I was thinking, well, is it that headquarters become spent? Like in order to conduct an attack, you have to like activate the headquarters, or in order to act, like in other games, they'll say that in order to activate some units, like some divisions, you have to activate a particular headquarters, and by doing it, you can then move the units associated with that headquarters. And I was thinking, well, is it that when you activate the headquarters, then it becomes non-active because it's already been used? Is that what non-active means? It's like the used side, and it seems like that is not what it is. It seems like non-active is kind of similar to being it's similar to more to like being disrupted, in the sense that when a unit is disrupted in other games, it can't really do much, and you have to kind of wait for it to get out of that state. Whereas in this game, they don't use the term disrupted because that's not. It's although it's similar, it's not exactly what it's trying to represent here. It just means that it's able to conduct normal operations. So, for example, as you'll see in the next one, a unit, some of these headquarters will be non-active because they're just not ready to do stuff yet. And then also earlier it said that a headquarters will become non-active if it is eliminated or if retreat is impossible, and it gets this displaced result that will force the unit to become non-active, and they have to wait until what is it called, the disruption recovery phase. Here you'll see. So it says, where is it? Yeah, here we go. Any headquarters units that are displaced are activated. So if a headquarters unit gets destroyed, or gets surrounded and eliminated, that creates this status called displaced, or I guess it's not really a status, but I guess it is a little bit of a status. It has the status of having been displaced, and by having been displaced, it becomes non-activated, so it can't do anything. You can't use it for any purpose until this disruption removal phase, at which point it can then get flipped to activated again. And when I read that, I was like, oh, okay, well, is it that because some of these headquarters start off non-activated, and I thought, well, is it that all of the headquarters get activated in this removal phase? And no, it's not. It's just the ones that were displaced. And you can also see during the movement phase, it says you can check to see any of his non-active headquarters have become activated. That's referring to what we're about to discuss, which is that as the turns go on, more and more headquarters become ready, able to be used, and that's what that activated phase means. But so, in order to just basically to summarize for my future self, it's not the case that like by conducting an attack, or just by moving the headquarters, it gets shifted, it gets spent, it gets used, and changed from this activated to non-activated or active to non-active state. So that's not what that is. That's not what is meant to be conveyed by this active and non-active state. Activation of Soviet headquarters, the Stavka Plan. This rule simulates the general inflexibility of the Soviet command structure and the consequent hesitancy in the commitment of reserves. At the start of the game, each headquarters unit counter is deployed on the game map with its non-active side face up. At the beginning of game turn 1, the 6th Army and 28th Army headquarters are activated. At the beginning of game turn 2, the 57th Army headquarters unit is activated, if it has not previously been. At the beginning of game turn 5, the 9th, 37th, and 38th Army headquarters are activated, if they have not previously been. So I just spent a couple minutes trying to understand this line, if it has not previously been activated here. And I couldn't find anything else in the rules that would specify what would cause these to be activated. The only thing I can think of is if the Germans destroyed these headquarters units and the headquarters units became displaced, then when they did their disruption removal phase, it would seem that these headquarters would then be switched to activated as part of that phase. So that's the only situation I can think of where these units would become activated prior to their scheduled activation turn. But I can keep looking, and if I see anything else, I'll put it in the comments of the video. Supply. General rule. In order to be moved up to its full capacity and attack and defend at full strength, a unit must be in supply. Procedure. At the beginning of each movement phase, prior to the movement of any units, the phasing player determines which of his units are in supply. Those units only may be moved up to the limit of their movement point allowances and used to execute overruns. Those units only. Okay. During each combat phase, immediately prior to the resolution of each attack in turn, the supply status of the attacking and defending units is determined. Those units in supply only attack and defend at full strength. So you have to determine supply twice. That's unusual. In most games, you only have to determine supply once per turn per unit. Cases. Line of supply. A line of supply is a path of consecutive adjacent hexes. A line of supply may not be traced through an enemy-occupied hex. A line of supply may not be traced through an enemy-controlled hex unless it is occupied by a friendly unit. And it's interesting in this game, in these rules, they use the term enemy-controlled hex, where in modern games or more recent games they would just say EZOC, an enemy zone of control. Soviet and Romanian supply. For a Soviet or Romanian unit to be in supply, two conditions must be fulfilled. It must be possible to trace a line of communications from an active friendly headquarters unit to that combat unit, and it must be possible to trace a line of supply from a supply source to the headquarters unit. Got it. Any hex on the eastern edge of the game map constitutes a supply source for the Soviet headquarters units. Supply sources for the Romanian headquarters unit are the same as for German units. For Soviet headquarters units, there is no limit to the length of a supply line. Okay? Limitations on the length of the supply line for the Romanian headquarters unit are the same as for German units. Okay? German supply. For a German unit to be in supply, it must be possible to trace a line of supply from a supply source to the unit. Any city hex that has not been occupied by any Soviet unit at any point in the game constitutes a supply source for German units. A line of supply traced from a city hex to a German unit cannot exceed 15 hexes. Any road hex may constitute a supply source for German units. A line of supply traced from such a road hex to a German unit cannot exceed 5 hexes. In order for a road hex to constitute a supply source for German units, it must be possible to trace an unbroken path of road hexes from the western edge of the game map or from hex 3932 to that hex. No hex in that line may be occupied by a Soviet unit or be in a Soviet zone of control unless it is occupied by an Axis unit. So I wanted to know what they were talking about with this hex 3932. So if you look at the map, let's zoom out a bit here. That is this hex right here. So this is the north-south boundary line. So if I rotate that, that's coming from the south then. And so this is the western edge of the map, western edge of the, of the map. So this is supply coming from the south. An Axis line of supply may not be traced more than 1 hex across the Donets River. That is, an Axis unit on the eastern side of the river must be adjacent to it in order to be in supply. So if I look at the map here, so this is north-south. So if we're looking north-south, this is the Donets River. So this is like basically the Soviet side of the map. So that's kind of like a big incentive. Oh, it goes up around here. So this is... So then what's this river? Doesn't have a name. Okay, well, this is the Donets. So it seems like that's a big incentive for the Germans to not cross that river. Okay, so I just spent a minute rereading this to try to wrap my head around this. So basically there's a big difference between Soviet and Romanian supply and German supply, where the Soviets can draw from a supply source to an HQ, and then from an HQ to one of their subordinate, divisions, or regiments, whatever the unit scale is, I forget. However, for the Germans, every individual German unit has to trace from the source of supply to that particular German unit. So that is a huge difference, because I was thinking, well, maybe the Germans can just park their headquarters on the other side of the Donets and send their other units further out, but no, they can't do that because of the difference in the way supply is calculated. There is no limit, aside from those listed in cases 1131 and 1132, on the length of any Axis line of supply which crosses the Donets north of the 1400 hex row, inclusive. Okay, I just spent another minute trying to wrap my head around this rule. Basically, what it's saying is that if you are the Germans, if you're in the south here, I've got this oriented, I believe, north to south. Here's the north to south dividing line. If the supply is tracing across a river here, which is south of the 1400 line, here's the 1400 row. You can see 1400 row. So if you're south of that row, you basically you want to cross. You need to have this line across the road. You need to have this road crossing across the river in order to get your supply across. If you're just crossing the river at a random hex here where there's no crossing, then you can only go one hex across the river and still be in supply. So basically, as the Germans, you have a big incentive to capture these crossing points, because once you capture those crossing points, then your supply can go whoosh through the other side. But if you don't have those crossing points, then your supply can only go one hex across the river. So that's what the rule is getting at. And then it says, if you're north of the 1400 row, which is here, if you're north of there, then you can cross anywhere. You can just, the supply can cross anywhere across the river, and it can keep going. So that limitation is only south of the 1400 row. There is no limit, aside from cases 1131 and 1132, on the length of any axis line of supply which crosses the Donets through a hex side intersected by a road. So that's also getting back to what I was saying, that just basically if you're south of the 1400 line, you really need to capture the road crossing in order to be able to push further. Axis units may also be supplied by air. See case 13.2. Units out of supply. Any unit that is out of supply at the beginning of a friendly movement phase has its movement point allowance halved in that phase and cannot be used to execute an overrun. This is true even if, due to subsequent movement during that phase, the unit is in a position where it would be in supply. Note also that a unit that is in supply at the start of a movement phase is considered to be in supply for the entire phase, even if it is moved to a position where it would be out of supply. Supply for combat is determined at the instant of combat. Therefore, it is possible for a unit that was in supply at the start of a combat phase to be placed out of supply due to the advance or retreat of other units prior to the resolution of an attack against it. Any combat unit that is out of supply has its combat strength halved on attack and defense. This reduction is effected after any other modifications for terrain or divisional integrity have been made. Any fractional combat strengths are rounded down, except that no unit may ever be reduced to a strength of less than 1. Okay, I had to think about that for a second because that is unusual. I think in the other systems that I've read, normally what happens is it's the number on the counter that gets halved. And then you add any other modifications for terrain or other stuff. So this is a bit of a different way of doing it, where you first do the other modifiers and then you apply the halving. So that's different from like the Simonitch system, for example. So that's interesting. Units may exist out of supply indefinitely. No unit is ever eliminated solely for lack of supply. Untried units. General rule. The combat strengths of Soviet units that have not yet participated in combat, with the exception of Guards rifle divisions, are untried, that is, unknown, to both the Soviet and Axis players. All untried Soviet combat units are placed on the game map in their untried state, whether as initial deployment or reinforcements. Units are picked by type, rifle, cavalry, or armor, from the pool of counters provided. The term armor includes tank brigades and motorized infantry. Once a unit has been committed to combat, the true strength of the unit is revealed at the instant of combat. Units committed to combat in an untried state may not be withdrawn or reallocated, even if the revealed ratio proves unfavorable. Air points are applied before revealing units. Once revealed, Soviet units remain revealed. Air power. General rule. Each game turn, the players receive a number of air points which they may use in combat. Axis air points may also be used to supply Axis units. The number of air points provided for each side per game turn is printed on the turn record track. Okay, I needed a second to process that. So the Axis can either use their air points to attack, or for combat, or they can use it to supply their units that might be out of supply. Cases: air power and combat. Each player may apply his air points to help him obtain better odds in combat. Before the ratio for a given combat has been calculated, and before revealing untried units, either or both players may allocate air points. The attacker announces his intention to use air points first, then the defender, by placing his air point counter on the hex in question. No more than one air point counter per side may be allotted in a given combat. The expenditure of an air point on a given combat adjusts the ratio one column in favor of the player using the air point. Thus, a 2-to-1 attack with air power becomes a 3-to-1. If that combat had air power used defensively, the 2-to-1 would become 1-to-1. Air points may not be used in overruns. Axis airdrop supply. In the Axis air supply phase, the Axis player may expend any air points not used in that game turn to give supply to certain units. He simply places the unused air points counters on the hexes he wishes to supply. All units in that hex at the time of placement only are in supply for the ensuing full game turn. So if we check the beginning where it gives the game turn sequence, and you come down to the Axis player turn, there's the air supply phase. So it's the last thing that they do. German mechanized divisional integration. General rule. Under certain circumstances, the combat strength of individual panzer divisions and the Panzergrenadier division may be doubled. Cases: Schwerpunkt tactics. Each German panzer division and the Panzergrenadier division is composed of 3 units. Whenever all 3 units of the same division are stacked in the hex, the combined combat strength of the division is doubled for combat, attack and defense, and overrun. I see. So each of those units would be like a regiment, I guess? Okay. The combined combat strength is doubled. Okay, so that's a huge bonus. Mobile defense tactics. The 3 component units of a German mechanized division may be doubled for defense only, even when the units are not in the same hex, if all of the following conditions are met. No unit of the division is stacked with a unit not of the division. Okay. It must be possible to trace a line of communications no longer than 2 hexes from each unit of the division to at least one other unit of the division. The line of communication may not be traced through an enemy unit or a friendly unit not of the same division. Enemy zones of control have no effect on this line of communications. Okay. 2 hexes. Got it. Restrictions on mechanized divisional integrity. Divisional integrity applies only to German mechanized units. To obtain divisional integrity, all 3 units must be from the same division. 1 or more of the units may be reduced. But should any constituent part of a German mechanized unit be eliminated, that division can never again obtain divisional integrity. Interesting. So this reminds me of the Rebel Fury system that Mark Herman just came out with, where they have something called core integrity, where if you have two division units that are adjacent to each other, you get a bonus during your combat. So this is like another way of doing that. So it's interesting to see how the different systems are different that way. German infantry divisional breakdown, strong points, and garrisons. General rule. German infantry divisions may be broken down into separate regiments, substituting regimental counters for the division counter. German infantry regiments may form strong points. City hexes that have not been captured by the Soviet player have an intrinsic garrison defense strength. Cases. Infantry divisional breakdown. There are 15 regimental counters provided in Kharkov. When setting up the game, these counters are placed in the German regimental breakdown units box on the game map. During his initial movement phase of each game turn, as well as during his initial deployment, the Axis player may substitute regimental counters for any infantry division. The Axis player removes the division counter from its hex and places it in the box, replacing it with the requisite number and strength of regimental counters. Note: players should take care to distinguish between the 2-8 and 1-8 regiment counters and the 2-8-1-8 division counters, which are used to represent divisions reduced by combat results. The following patterns of breakdown are possible. If the original unit is a 9-8 infantry division, you can break it down into 3 2-8 regiments. If it was a 4-8 infantry division, you can break it down into 3 1-8 regiments. If it was a 2, you can break it down into 2 1 strength regiments. If it was a 7 combat power division, you can break it down into 2 combat power and 1 combat power regiment. So basically you're getting penalized. You get penalized for breaking it down. And if you had it 3 combat power, when you break it down, you get 2 1 combat power regiments. Any German infantry division that has not yet been moved may be broken down by the Axis player during his initial movement phase. Breakdown costs no movement points, and the regiments may be moved normally in the phase they are placed on the game map. Regiments may be reformed into divisions. Only divisions currently in the German regimental breakdown units box may be reformed. This is done by moving the requisite number of regiments into the same hex. Reforming costs no movement points. Division counters are substitute for regiment counters after all movement has been completed. Okay, so it's when you break it down, the division, you have to move the division into that box. Did it say that? Yeah, so that's how you keep track of because some divisions may not have arrived on the map yet. Or some divisions may have been eliminated. So in order to keep track of which divisions are actually on the map and could be reformed, you just move the counter into that box. That makes sense. Stacking restrictions must be observed at all times when breaking down or reforming divisions. Breakdown and reformation may be executed in enemy-controlled hexes. Okay. All regiments have one step only in terms of combat losses. A 2 combat power regiment does not become a 1 combat power regiment when it incurs a 1-step loss. It is eliminated. The Axis player is limited to the 15 regiment counters provided in the counter mix. Players may not make additional regiment counters to allow additional breakdowns. However, an equivalent number of eliminated regiments may be traded for divisions in the German regimental breakdown units box, and thus be made available for breakdown once again. Eliminated regiments. Okay. Be traded for divisions in the German regimental breakdown units box. So this is a bit weird. So I think what this is saying is that suppose you have one division and 3 regiment counters in the box. So suppose you have the division on the map and you have 3 regiments in the box. You trade the division counter on the map for the 3 regiment counters. And then suppose you have 3 other regiments counters that have been eliminated. If I'm understanding this correctly, you can basically forfeit the ability to reform that division that's on the map. You can forfeit that in exchange for 3 of those eliminated regiment counters to be put into that box. So it's a bit unusual. I mean, I don't understand really what the justification for that is, but I think I'm understanding that rule correctly. I'll have to think about that. German strongpoints. Infantry regiments may form strongpoints. When a regiment constitutes a strongpoint, all combat results except DE, which results in the elimination of the regiment, have no effect against it when attacked. Oh, interesting. Okay. During his initial movement phase, the Axis player may have a regiment which is not moved during that phase form a strongpoint. He places a strongpoint marker on top of the unit. Only regiments may be used to form strongpoints. To form a strongpoint, a regiment must be alone in a hex. It need not be in supply. Disrupted regiments may not form strongpoints. To maintain a strongpoint, a regiment must not be moved or attack, and must remain the only unit in the hex. If any other unit is moved or retreated into a hex containing a strongpoint, the strongpoint marker is removed. Exception: if a unit is retreated through a hex containing a strongpoint, but does not end its retreat there, it does not affect the strongpoint. Strongpoints have no zone of control. Although only DE results affect a regiment in a strongpoint, any results incurred by the attacker do affect the attacking units. Okay. Right. So if the Soviets are attacking, the Soviets do suffer whatever the result on the CRT is. Okay, and what the marker looks like is this. And you can see it here in the bag there. German city garrisons. At the start of the game, each city hex has an intrinsic garrison. In order for the Soviet player to move units into such a hex, the garrison must be eliminated. The defense strength of each hex's garrison is equal to the number printed in that hex. Garrisons may never be moved, cannot attack, and have no zone of control. A garrison hex does negate enemy zones of control for purposes of supply and retreats. Garrison strength points are equivalent to normal strength points in all respects, except that they are not doubled for being a city. An attack against a garrison eliminates it if any result is obtained that requires a retreat or step loss for the defender. Garrisons do not count towards stacking. When Soviet units attack a hex containing a unit and a garrison, their defense strengths are combined. For example, if a 9 combat power unit were deployed in hex 0819, the defense strength would be 19. 18 for the doubled infantry division, plus 1 for the garrison. A garrison has no step to lose. Any losses must be absorbed by the real units in the hex. However, the garrison is destroyed only if all Axis units in the hex are eliminated or retreated as a result of combat. Destroyed garrisons are permanently eliminated and never return, even if Axis troops recapture that city hex. Okay, so I wanted to take a look on the map to see an example of these garrison units. So there's these numbers here in Kharkov. You also have some further west. So here's some on the south. Dnipropetrovsk. Not sure how to pronounce that. And here, Poltava. So that's what those look like. And they're not all one. These ones are two. Reinforcements. General rule. Both sides receive reinforcements, new units, according to the schedule on the game map. These reinforcements may be delayed as the players wish, but they must enter where indicated. Reinforcements arrive during the initial movement phases, each unit expending movement points for the first hex entered. Reinforcements may use rail movement, conduct overruns, and attack. They are in supply for the player turn in which they arrive. Soviet reinforcements still need headquarters units to attack. Cases. Soviet reinforcements. All Soviet reinforcements enter anywhere north of the front line on the eastern map edge. North of the front line. What do they mean by the front line? Is that the north-south? Front line. North of the front line. Well, front line. Okay, so the front line is this thing. This dotted line. North of the front line. I guess what that means is... Yeah, I guess what that means is that it's north of... So they can't... Oh, okay. What that means, I think, is that they can't enter here. This is the eastern map edge, but it's south of the front line. So they can enter anywhere north of this front line on the eastern map edge. That's what that means. Got it. Axis reinforcements. At the start of Axis player turn 5, the German 4th Corps arrives in any hex on the south edge of the game map. South edge, okay. The 4th Corps consists of the 22nd Panzer Division, the 203rd Regiment, the 129th Regiment, and the 140th Regiment, plus the 76th, 94th, 75th, and 376th Infantry Divisions. Okay. All other reinforcements enter anywhere on the north edge of the game map, west of the current Axis front line. Interesting. If this is hard to determine, these divisions may enter anywhere west of hex 0116. So it's interesting that they don't come from the west. They come from the north or the south. Hex 0116. 0116. Okay, so here's 0116. Was that it? Or is it 0116? Oh, okay, so that's here. 0116. So that's the west edge of the map. And they come anywhere west of 0116. Oh, do I have this oriented incorrectly? Okay, yeah, I have this oriented wrong. So this is the north edge of the map. 0116. 1-6 is here. So this is, again, the north edge of the map, anywhere west of here. That's what they're saying, and that's the Donets River there. Okay, and that's the front line. Victory conditions. General rule. Except in the case of a draw, victory is awarded to the player who obtains the most victory points. Some points are obtained for transitory achievements during the course of the game, and the players will have to keep track of them. After the completion of game turn 10, the players determine their points totals. To determine the level of victory achieved, the lesser total is subtracted from the greater, and the difference compared to the levels of victory printed on the game map. Cases. Victory points for either player. The 3 cities on the game map are each worth victory points to the player who controls them at the end of the game. The Axis player controls a city if the garrisons in each hex are still extant, or if Axis units occupy or were the last to occupy each hex of the city, and each hex is in supply. Treat each hex as if it were a combat unit to determine this. Okay. The Soviet player controls a city if Soviet units occupy or were the last to occupy each hex of the city, and a line of supply can be traced from the eastern edge of the game map to each hex. If neither player can fulfill these conditions for any city, then no points are awarded for that city. Well, how many points do you get? Does it say? Soviet victory points. At any point during the game that Soviet units are advanced into a city hex, the Soviet player immediately receives 6 victory points. Into a city hex. Okay. The Soviet player can never obtain more than 6 points for capturing any one city hex, even if the hex is recaptured by Axis forces and then again retaken by Soviet troops. However, the Soviet player does receive 6 points for each different city hex he captures. Okay? The Soviet player receives 3 victory points for each game turn in which, following the Axis player turn, Kharkov is either cut off or controlled by Soviet forces. The Soviet player receives 3 victory points. Okay. For each game turn in which, following the Axis player turn, Kharkov is either cut off or controlled by Axis forces. Kharkov is considered cut off if at least one hex of the city is not controlled by the Soviet player, and one or more hexes of the roads leading from Kharkov to Poltava, one or more hexes of the roads leading from Kharkov to Poltava and to Dnipropetrovsk are occupied by Soviet units. Of all of the roads, presumably that means one or more hexes of all of the roads. Okay, I get it. And it has to be, the hex has to be occupied. It's not just the enemy, the zone of control. Okay, got it. The Soviet player receives 2 victory points for each game turn in which, following the Axis player turn, the Axis player has failed to maintain a continuous front of friendly units and or their zones of control from the northern to the southern or eastern edges of the game map. Okay. Continuous front. I'm not sure what they mean by that. Do they... And or... Oh, so... Oh, okay. So that you have to trace a line of hexes that are either occupied by Axis units or their zones of control. Got it. The Soviet player receives victory points for the elimination of Axis units. These are awarded at the end of the game only. Basically, the Soviet player gets points for destroying German divisions with smaller awards for extra parts of divisions. Okay, what does extra parts mean? Note, for the elimination of 3 panzer regiments from different divisions, the Soviet player would be awarded a total of 9 points. For the elimination of all 3 regiments from one panzer division, he would be awarded 12 victory points, not 9 or 21. Okay, I'm not sure how these points are being calculated, though. Okay. Axis victory points. The Axis player receives victory points for the elimination of Soviet units. These are awarded at the end of the game only. Any Soviet unit not in supply at the end of the game is considered eliminated for the purpose of awarding victory points. Yes, but how many points do you get per unit? That's bizarre. It doesn't say how you're supposed to calculate that. Is it on the map? Or oh, here we go. Yeah, it is. Okay. Schedule of victory points. Victory points for either player: 25 VPs for control of Kharkov at the end of the game, 10 VPs for control of Poltava, 10 VPs for control of Dnipropetrovsk. Victory points for the Soviet player: 12 VPs for each German panzer division destroyed, 6 VPs per city hex captured at any time during the game, in addition to any points for holding whole cities. 3 victory points for each German Panzer or Panzer Grenadier regiment or other infantry unit destroyed. 3 VPs per game turn for holding or cutting off Kharkov. 2 VPs per game turn for a hole in the Axis line. 1 VP for each Romanian infantry division, German security division, or German infantry regiment destroyed. Okay, that was what I was wondering about. Victory points for the Axis player: 3 VPs for each Russian Guards Rifle Division destroyed, and 1 VP for any other Soviet unit destroyed. Interesting. Okay. So the Germans are really just trying to hold on to these cities and destroy Soviet units. Interesting. Okay. And, oh, here we go. Levels of victory. Net the player's points at the end of the game. If the total is 0 to 10 difference, if there's a 0 to 10 point difference, it's a draw. If there's an 11 to 25 victory point difference, it's a marginal victory. 26 to 50 is a substantive victory. 51 or more is a decisive victory. So controlling Kharkov minus. So I think that would mean, yeah, okay. It's hard to calculate, like, it's hard to, off the top of my head, envision what that would look like. But it looks like it's maybe, yeah, I mean, if the Soviets have Kharkov, but they don't have these other ones. Yet I'm going to have to just play it and see what victory looks like. Because, you know, one of the things that I like to do is I like to kind of draw out what a marginal victory would look like and then aim for a marginal victory if I'm up against a competent player. And then if my opponent ends up not being very competent or they get bad luck, then I can maybe go for a more aggressive victory. But got it. So that's the victory points. Rules summary. This summary does not in any way supersede the rules. The initial setup is listed in case 5.2, and the reinforcements and their points of entry are listed in section 16. The Axis player sets up first. Unless otherwise stated, all units at the start of the game must be adjacent to or within 1 hex of the front line. The sequence of play is asymmetrical, with both players having movement, combat, and disruption removal phases, and the Soviet player only having a reserves commitment phase, and the Axis player only having a mechanized movement and an air supply phase. Rail movement of up to a maximum of 40 hexes may be used by 3 Axis units and 5 Soviet units, plus an unlimited number of Soviet headquarters units each game turn. A unit moved by rail must begin and end its movement on a rail hex, and may not enter an enemy zone of control, leave the railroad, or cross the front line. Overruns may be conducted at a cost of 3 movement points. Soviet overruns are limited to 1 per active headquarters unit. Axis overruns are unlimited. Units must begin the movement phase stacked in the same hex and in supply to execute an overrun. Units successfully overrun are disrupted. Disrupted units do retain a zone of control but may not move. Stacking is limited to 3 combat units. Headquarters and informational markers do not count. It's interesting that stacking is limited to 3 combat units. It doesn't distinguish between a division and a regiment. Zones of control halt movement and cut supply, lines of communication, and retreat in hexes not occupied by friendly units. Headquarters units have no zone of control. The combat results table is a ratio table with terrain advantages reflected in modifications to units' combat strengths, that is, being halved, doubled, etc. Retreat is conducted by the losing player, who chooses either to retreat the mandated number of hexes or lose that many steps. Advance along the path of retreat, or 2 hexes if loser is eliminated, by victorious units is allowed. Soviet units only must stop if they enter an enemy zone of control. Read word for word Case 6.5, Additional Restrictions on Axis Movement, Case 6.6, German Tactical Disengagement, Case 6.7, Additional Restrictions on Soviet Movement, Case 6.8, Soviet Breakout Mobility, Case 9.8, Soviet Breakthrough Morale, Case 9.9, Armor Superiority, Section 10, Headquarters Units, Section 11, Supply, Section 13, Air Power, Section 14, German Mechanized Divisional Integrity, and Section 15, German Infantry Divisional Breakdown, Strongpoints, and Garrisons. And those are the rules. The only remaining stuff is just like history of the battle. I'll probably do that as a separate video. But cool. I can't wait to play this. This is going to be fun.